Tonight, we uncover a story older than the Bible, older than Moses, a creation myth the church tried to bury beneath centuries of doctrine. The Sumerians wrote of gods who shaped man from clay, granted knowledge as a gift, and walked among humanity as teachers, not rulers. Their tablets reveal floods, divine councils, and ziggurats reaching toward the sky, all predating Genesis by thousands of years. But when scholars tried to trace these truths, they were silenced, ignored, or branded heretics. What the church preserved as scripture was only a fragment, an edited version designed to control what mankind could know. And the forgotten chapters, the voices of gods and goddesses, the original spark of human enlightenment, remain locked away in archives, hidden from view. So before you step further into this forbidden history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because what you are about to see is a story the world was never meant to remember. 1,000 years before the words of Genesis were ever written, before Moses, before the prophets, another voice whispered the same story from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Not in parchment or scrolls, but in clay. And when those tablets were found thousands of years later, they told a tale that shook the very roots of what we call creation. A story older than Eden, older than Adam, and yet almost identical to the Bible itself. The church called it myth, but the clay said otherwise. It said, "In the beginning, there were not one, but many creators. They were not angels or spirits, but beings of immense knowledge, shaping the world long before mankind opened its eyes." The Sumerians, a civilization that rose around 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, left behind more written records than any other ancient people. In their cities of Uruk and Eridu, they carved stories about the first dawn, the flood, the garden, and the making of man. Stories that mirrored Genesis, almost line by line. But these stories were written long before any Hebrew scribe set ink to parchment. So what came first, the myth or the holy word? The first line of the Bible reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But the Sumerian tablets, written more than 1,000 years earlier, spoke of a time when the heavens and the earth were not yet separated, when the world was a sea of mist, ruled by ancient forces called An and Ki. An, the god of the heavens, and Ki, the goddess of the earth. Together, they gave birth to all that would ever exist. Their union was the true beginning, the first Genesis. From them came Enlil, the lord of air, who split heaven and earth apart, allowing light and life to exist. The act of separation, of bringing order to chaos, was their version of let there be light. Yet this story, though older and eerily familiar, was never taught in churches or written into Christian teachings. Because if Genesis was inspired by Sumerian tales, it would mean the foundation of the world's most sacred text did not begin in Jerusalem or Sinai, but in Mesopotamia, thousands of years earlier. Imagine a world where creation was not an act of divine love, but of divine necessity. The gods, according to the tablets, were weary. They needed helpers. They shaped mankind from the clay of the earth, mixed with the blood of a god. Humanity was created not as a divine image, but as a servant, a caretaker for those who ruled from the sky. This idea would echo later in Genesis, but the tone would change. The Bible says man was made in the image of God, blessed and chosen. The Sumerians said man was made to serve, to labor, to bear the weight of divine work, and the church, knowing this, chose silence. For centuries, these ancient tablets remained buried beneath the sands of Iraq until explorers uncovered them in the 1800s. What they found was not myth, but memory, the first written story of creation, a story the world was never meant to hear. Long before the story of Adam and Eve was ever whispered among the Hebrews, the Sumerians had already written of a being shaped from the dust of the earth. Their story did not begin in a garden, but in the shadow of divine labour. The gods, weary from their endless work of shaping rivers, tending fields, and maintaining the heavens, decided they needed help. So they gathered in the city of Nippur and made a plan. They would create a new being, one that could serve them, feed them, and carry their burdens. Not out of love, but out of necessity. According to the ancient clay tablets, the goddess Ninhursag, also called the mother of all living, took clay from the banks of the river and mixed it with the blood of a sacrificed god. From that union, man was born, a creature both earthly and divine. He was called Lulu, the mixed one, a servant to the divine. When the goddess shaped him, she whispered into him the breath of life. It was not a blessing, it was an instruction to build, to grow, to labour in place of the gods. When the Bible later spoke of God forming man from the dust of the ground and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, it echoed the same act, but with a new tone, one of love and purpose. Yet the structure of the story, the clay, the breath, the life, all came from these older Sumerian myths. The church would later dismiss this as coincidence, but there are too many parallels to ignore. The Sumerian gods walked among men, teaching them to plant, to write, to count the stars. They were not distant, they were rulers, visible and commanding. Humanity was their workforce. The Sumerian creation stories say clearly that man was made so the gods could rest. And once the work began, the divine beings withdrew, leaving priests and kings as their voices on earth. It was order born from exhaustion. The Sumerians did not see creation as a gift. They saw it as an arrangement. You serve, and the gods provide. But as generations passed, the humans grew restless. They began to question why they were made to toil under the gaze of the sky gods, while those above lived in eternal ease. Some legends say that when mankind cried out in anger, the god Enki took pity. He was the one who broke the rule, the one who gave humans wisdom and the knowledge of their own origin. For this, he was condemned, just as the serpent would be later in Genesis. The story repeated, only the names changed. To the Sumerians, the act of creation was not holy, it was pragmatic. Yet within that pragmatic act, something miraculous happened. The clay remembered. The spark of divinity inside man refused to remain silent. And from that moment on, humanity began its long journey to reclaim the knowledge it was never meant to have. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates lies a land once called Sumer, known today as Mesopotamia, the place where civilization itself was born. It was here that humanity first built cities, mapped the stars, and wrote the earliest known words. Every kingdom that followed, from Babylon to Rome, traced its roots back to this stretch of fertile soil. The people who lived here called it the land between two rivers, and they believed it was not merely a home for mankind, but a meeting ground between heaven and earth. In this land rose great cities like Uruk, Ur, and Eridu, each crowned with massive temples known as ziggurats. These were not ordinary buildings. They were stairways of stone and mud brick, built to connect the world of man with the world of the gods. Each level was a step closer to the heavens, and at the top, priests would offer prayers, not inside dark sanctuaries, but under the open sky. To the Sumerians, mathematics was not a science. It was a sacred language. They used it to align their temples with the stars, to calculate the cycles of the moon, and to measure the passage of time with stunning precision. They understood that numbers were not just tools, but symbols of cosmic order. To live in harmony with the universe, one had to understand its rhythm, and that rhythm was written in the movement of the heavens. Thousands of years before telescopes or modern astronomy, the Sumerians had already charted the paths of the planets. They named constellations and linked them to their gods. They knew that the rising of Venus marked new beginnings, that the moon governed the tides, and that eclipses were messages from the divine. It was not superstition. It was observation elevated to worship. Their priests were not just religious leaders. They were mathematicians, astronomers, and architects. They ruled through knowledge. In Sumer, kings did not claim divine power through birthright, but through divine permission. Each ruler was said to have been chosen by the gods, a bridge between the mortal world and the celestial. Yet behind the golden titles and sacred rituals, there was a secret truth. The gods were not always present. They communicated through symbols, through patterns in the stars, through the whisper of mathematics. And those who could interpret these signs held power greater than any army. This was how the idea of divine kingship began, not from conquest, but from the claim of understanding the heavens. It was here that religion and science were one, where geometry built temples and astronomy guided faith. But in time, that unity would be broken. When later civilizations inherited these teachings, they kept the rituals but forgot the knowledge behind them. What was once a sacred science became superstition, and the true purpose of the ziggurats was lost. Yet beneath every cathedral, pyramid, and temple built afterward lies the same ancient design, born from this land between two rivers, where the gods once walked and humanity learned to look up. The Sumerians believed their gods did not live in the clouds of imagination but descended from the stars. They called them the Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens to shape the earth. Among them were three who ruled above all others: Anu, Enlil, and Enki, a divine trinity that governed the sky, the air, and the waters beneath. Anu was the father, the distant ruler who watched from the highest heavens. Enlil was the commander of the earth and the winds, the enforcer of order and law. Enki was the keeper of wisdom, master of the deep, the one who shaped rivers and gave humanity the spark of knowledge. Their stories begin not as myths of creation, but as records of arrival. The tablets speak of Anu descending in blazing light, of Enlil carving the skies with thunder, and of Enki walking the marshes where no life yet bloomed. The Sumerians did not describe these events as dreams or visions. They wrote of them as history, carefully inscribed in cuneiform, as if documenting visitors from beyond their world. To them, the gods were not invisible. They were present, teaching mankind how to build, how to count, and how to speak the words of power. Anu ruled from above, rarely descending to earth. Enlil, his son, took command over the lands and demanded obedience. He saw mankind as a tool, a creation meant to serve. But Enki, the youngest, saw potential. He saw in humanity something sacred, something worth more than labor. Their rivalry defined the ancient world. The tablets describe councils of the gods, disagreements, and even punishments. When the humans grew too noisy, when their numbers grew beyond control, it was Enlil who ordered a great flood to wipe them away. It was Enki who defied that command, warning a mortal named Ziusudra to build a vessel and preserve life. Thousands of years later, that same story would appear again, rewritten as the tale of Noah and the Ark. The Sumerians never called their gods perfect. They argued, they envied, they loved, and they punished. They were powerful but flawed, reflections of their own creation. Yet behind the myth lies a haunting question. Why did the Sumerians describe their gods as beings who came from the sky? Why did they draw winged figures in strange suits, holding tools that look eerily mechanical? To them, these were not symbols of faith, but memories of encounters. Every ritual, every temple, every offering was a way to remember the time when the gods walked among them. As centuries passed, their stories spread to Akkad, Babylon, and eventually the lands of the Bible. Anu became El, Enlil became Yahweh, Enki became the serpent of knowledge. The names changed, but the roles remained. And while the church would later label these stories as pagan myths, the resemblance was too close to ignore. Maybe these were not myths at all. Maybe they were memories, faint echoes of a forgotten age when the sky truly opened and something extraordinary stepped through. In the oldest stories ever written, long before the book of Genesis, the gods did not simply command life into being. They created it with their own hands. In the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis, two ancient Mesopotamian texts discovered on clay tablets, the birth of humanity was not a miracle of spirit, but a careful act of design. The gods gathered clay from the riverbanks, rich and red with minerals, and mixed it with the blood of a slain deity. From that strange union of earth and divine essence, mankind was born, not from nothing, but from something, a fusion. The gods, weary from endless labour, had decided they needed helpers. They had built the rivers, planted the fields, raised the mountains, and now they wanted rest. The lesser gods, tired and rebellious, cried out for relief, so the higher gods devised a solution. They would fashion a new being, one capable of bearing their burdens. The clay symbolized the earth, the body. The blood represented divinity, the spirit. The result was a creature half mortal, half divine, both servant and child. This was not creation by love, it was creation by purpose. Yet within that purpose, something unexpected happened. The mixture produced more than labourers, it produced thinkers. The Sumerians believed that when the goddess Ninhursag moulded mankind, she whispered into the clay the secret of awareness. Enki, the god of wisdom, oversaw the process. He added what the texts call the image of the gods, a mysterious phrase echoed thousands of years later in Genesis, where it says that man was made in the image of God. The parallels are undeniable, but the tone could not be more different. In the Sumerian version, humanity was a project, one that might fail, one that could be corrected or remade if it did not serve its purpose. The gods experimented. They shaped bodies of mud that collapsed, creatures that could not speak, beings that withered in days. Then, finally, one mixture worked, a hybrid capable of thought, emotion, and endurance. Some scholars believe this was never meant to be symbolic. The texts describe the process with startling precision, as if recounting an ancient memory of biological manipulation. The term mixing of essence appears again and again, suggesting the blending of two different forms of life. To the ancients, this was divine alchemy. To modern minds, it sounds eerily like genetic engineering. It is this part of the story that the Church has long avoided, because it suggests that creation was not a single act of divine will, but a collaboration between beings, and perhaps a mistake that became destiny. Humanity, in this telling, was not perfect from the start. We were flawed by design, bound by both the clay of the earth and the spark of the gods, caught between obedience and curiosity. And maybe that is why, from the beginning, humans looked to the sky, searching for the faces of those who made them. The first question was not who is God, but who made us, and why did they stop? Among all the gods of Sumer, none was more beloved or more feared than Enki. He was called the Lord of Wisdom, the Keeper of Secrets, the one who shaped rivers and guided the flow of knowledge itself. While his brother Enlil ruled with command and punishment, Enki ruled through understanding. He did not command mankind to kneel, he taught them to stand. The ancient tablets say Enki defied the divine council more than once. When the higher gods ordered that humanity remain ignorant and obedient, Enki disobeyed. He gave humans the knowledge to survive, to write, to measure the heavens, to plant crops, to heal with herbs, to build temples, and to navigate the stars. He showed them that the world could be understood through reason, not only through fear. In the temples of Eridu, the oldest city on earth, Enki was worshipped not as a ruler, but as a friend. The priests said his waters flowed beneath the ground, bringing life and understanding wherever they reached. His symbol was the serpent, the creature that sheds its skin, the symbol of rebirth and transformation. Thousands of years later, that same serpent would appear again in another story, this time inside a garden. But there, it would be recast, not as a teacher, but as a deceiver. The story of Adam and Eve echoes the tale of Enki with haunting familiarity. A divine being offers humanity knowledge that has been forbidden. Humanity accepts, and in doing so, becomes self-aware. In the Sumerian story, this act was seen as a blessing. In the biblical version, it became the first sin. The church taught that the serpent led mankind to fall, but the Sumerians believed that Enki led mankind to rise. He was the spark that turned servants into seekers. Yet even as he helped humanity, he paid a heavy price. The other gods saw his defiance as betrayal. Enlil cursed his name, accusing him of corrupting the natural order. The council decreed that mankind would suffer for his rebellion, that knowledge would come with pain, that wisdom would bring sorrow, and that every discovery would cost something in return. But Enki did not stop. In secret, he continued to guide through symbols, dreams, and whispers carried by the river winds. He became the god of hidden wisdom, the one who helps only those who dare to look beyond what they are told. To the faithful, he was a protector. To the powerful, he was a threat. This is why the church, centuries later, turned his image into that of the serpent, a creature to be feared. The forbidden benefactor became the embodiment of temptation. Yet when we trace the story back to its roots, before Eden, before Scripture, we find that the serpent's first crime was not evil. It was compassion. Enki's defiance reminds us that the greatest rebellions in history were not born from hatred, but from love for truth. The oldest battle ever recorded was not fought between men, but between gods. The Sumerians called it the divine rebellion, a cosmic struggle not for power, but for the soul of humanity. It began when mankind, newly created, began to think for itself. The gods who had shaped them expected obedience. They wanted labourers, worshippers, servants, to maintain their temples and bring them offerings. But Enki, the god of wisdom, saw something else. He saw within mankind the same spark that burned in the divine. He believed they deserved to grow, to learn, to become creators themselves. Enlil, his brother, disagreed. To him, humans were tools, bound to the order set by the heavens. He saw Enki's compassion as dangerous, a threat to divine control. The clay beings were not meant to question, yet now they built cities, mapped stars, and named themselves children of the gods. Enlil's anger shook the earth. The tablets say he called a council of the great gods and declared that mankind's freedom would lead to ruin. They would rebel, forget their place, and destroy the harmony of creation. He demanded punishment. Droughts, floods, and famine followed, but Enki intervened each time. When Enlil sent a plague, Enki taught humans healing. When he sent famine, Enki taught them irrigation. When Enlil darkened the skies, Enki revealed how to read the stars and predict their seasons. It was a war not of swords, but of knowledge and control. Each god sought to shape the destiny of man, in his own image. The others watched in silence as the brothers waged their conflict across the ages. The humans caught in between began to choose sides. Some worshipped Enlil, obeying his commands in fear. Others followed Enki, building secret schools of wisdom hidden deep within temple walls. This was the first division of belief, the first shadow of what would one day become heaven and hell. To follow Enlil was to submit and be saved. To follow Enki was to question and be condemned. The pattern was set, and it would repeat in every religion that came after. The rebellion of the gods was not only a story about divine pride, it was a mirror of humanity's own struggle between obedience and curiosity, between faith and freedom. Over time, Enlil's name faded, his image reshaped into that of a righteous father, a lawgiver. Enki's became twisted into the serpent, the deceiver. The church would later call one God and the other the devil, not realizing both were echoes of the same ancient tale. The war of heaven was never about good and evil, it was about control and liberation. The Sumerians understood that enlightenment always comes with a cost. To question authority is to challenge creation itself. Yet they also believed that somewhere deep in the blood of man, Enki's gift remains alive, whispering still, reminding us that knowledge, even forbidden, is the truest form of freedom. Thousands of years before the story of Noah and the ark appeared in the book of Genesis, the people of Sumer had already written of a great flood that wiped the earth clean. They called their hero Ziushudra, a righteous man chosen by the god Enki to survive when the world was drowned. The tale was carved into clay around the year 2000 before Christ, long before the Hebrews ever wandered the desert. In those tablets, the flood was not sent by chance. It was a deliberate act, ordered by the god Enlil to silence the noise of mankind. Humanity had grown restless. They no longer obeyed the gods or feared their power. Their cities echoed with music, laughter, and ambition. To Enlil, this was chaos. To Enki, it was life. The council of gods met in secret, and the decision was made. The waters of the abyss would rise and erase all that had been built, but Enki could not bear to see his creation perish. He broke the oath of silence and whispered the truth to one man. In a dream, Ziusudra saw Enki's voice carried by the river wind. "Build a vessel," he said. "Seal it with pitch. Take into it the seed of every living thing. When the flood comes, do not look back." The man obeyed. He built his boat, wide as a city street and tall as a temple tower. When the rains fell, they did not stop for 7 days and 7 nights. The seas rose over the land until even the mountains were swallowed. The gods themselves trembled at what they had unleashed. When the storm finally ended, Ziusudra opened the hatch and light returned. He released a dove, and when it did not return, he knew the earth was reborn. The gods repented for what they had done. Enlil, furious at Enki for saving mankind, wanted punishment. But Anu, the elder of heaven, declared that humans would live. Ziushudra was granted immortality and taken to a place beyond the rivers where no death could reach him. Centuries later, this same story would reappear in Babylon as the tale of Utnapishtim, then again in the Bible as Noah. The details changed, the names changed, but the heart of the story remained identical. A flood, a chosen man, a divine warning, a new beginning. So who copied whom? Was Genesis inspired by older myths, or was it preserving a memory shared across civilizations? The Church insists that Noah's story is unique, a revelation from God, but archaeology tells a quieter truth. The Sumerian tablets are thousands of years older. Their flood was not only a punishment but a reset, a moment when time itself began again. The world before the flood vanished from memory. as if erased from history. Perhaps that is why nearly every culture on Earth remembers a flood, because it was not myth at all. It was an event so vast, so terrifying, that it left an imprint on the collective soul of humanity. The flood did not only wash away the world, it washed away the past. Long before the Bible called it the Tower of Babel, the Sumerians built giant stairways of stone and clay that reached toward the sky. They called them ziggurats, houses of heaven, the bridges between the gods and mankind. These structures were not myths. They still stand today, weathered and silent, in the ruins of Ur, Eridu, and Babylon. Each was built as a mountain in the flat plains of Mesopotamia, a place where heaven could touch earth. Priests climbed their steps to offer sacrifices, not to ask for blessings, but to invite the gods to descend. In those days, the people believed their gods lived among the stars, travelling through the heavens in fiery chariots, and the ziggurats were their landing sites. Every level of the tower represented a different realm, from the dust of the world below to the shining firmament above. At the top stood a small shrine, painted blue like the sky, where only the highest priest could enter, waiting for the god to come down in radiant form. When archaeologists uncovered the foundations of the great ziggurat of Babylon, they found inscriptions describing it as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Yet in the book of Genesis, this same structure became a symbol of defiance. The people of Babylon, the story says, sought to build a tower to the heavens to make a name for themselves. God, angered by their pride, confused their language and scattered them across the earth. The church taught that this was punishment for arrogance, the moment mankind tried to rival the divine. But the Sumerian records tell a different story. They say the tower was not an act of rebellion, but of remembrance. After the great flood, when the world was new, people feared that the gods would never return. The ziggurats were built to call them back, to rekindle the bond between heaven and earth. The tower was a prayer in stone, a message written not in words but in architecture. The confusion of languages, too, was described differently. It was not a curse, but the natural result of civilizations spreading and evolving. The Bible turned a longing for connection into a lesson against pride, yet the echoes of the old meaning remain. The very word Babel comes from the Akkadian Bab Ilu, the gate of God. It was not meant as an insult, but as a name of reverence. When the Hebrews encountered Babylon centuries later, they misunderstood its sacred symbols, seeing in its temples not devotion but blasphemy. The church inherited that misunderstanding and carried it forward for 2,000 years. But perhaps the builders of Babel were not reaching up out of arrogance. Perhaps they were reaching up out of memory. They were trying to rebuild what was once real, to touch the sky where their gods had once descended. Every brick, every stair was a fragment of that lost connection. And when the last ziggurat crumbled into dust, the gate between heaven and earth closed forever. In the heart of ancient Sumer, long before parchment or ink, there were the tablets of destiny. The people believed these tablets held the power to shape reality itself. Whoever possessed them could command the elements, decide the fate of kingdoms, and even rewrite the order of heaven. They were not ordinary tablets carved from clay. The stories describe them as radiant objects, inscribed with divine symbols that no human hand could craft. The gods guarded them fiercely, for in their runes lay the balance of creation. When the god Enlil held the tablets, storms obeyed him, kings bowed to his will, and the laws of the cosmos remained stable. But when they were stolen, chaos followed. The myths say that a being named Anzu, a creature of both air and flame, once stole the tablets of destiny from Enlil's sanctuary. For a time, the world fell apart. The rivers stopped flowing, crops withered, and even the gods could not speak their decrees. Order itself depended on these tablets being returned. When they were finally recovered, the gods swore they would never again fall into mortal hands. But strange whispers lingered among the priests. Some believed fragments of these divine tablets survived on earth, hidden within temples or buried under ziggurats. They were said to contain not just laws, but codes of energy, the language of creation itself. To modernize, the descriptions sound less like myth and more like technology. Objects that glowed, emitted sound, and controlled invisible forces. Could the tablets of destiny have been something far more advanced than ancient myth suggests? The idea seems impossible, yet echoes of the same legend appear again and again. In Babylon, they were called the Tablets of Enuma. In Egypt, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. In Judea, the Stone Tablets of Moses. Each culture described a sacred object through which divine authority was transmitted, a device that connected heaven and earth, and centuries later, deep within the archives of the Vatican, references to these relics appear once more. Hidden in Latin manuscripts, seldom shown to the public, there are mentions of artifacts described as lapides imperii, stones of command, said to predate the Christian era. Some scholars speculate that they were confiscated during the Crusades or taken from ancient temples that once stood in Mesopotamia. The Church never confirmed their existence, but their secrecy speaks volumes. What were these objects that so many civilizations described with the same reverence and fear? If they were merely myths, why did the Church guard the idea of them so carefully? Perhaps the tablets of destiny were not just symbols of divine order, but remnants of an older world, one that understood forces we have since forgotten. The ancients called it magic, the Church called it heresy, and we call it myth. Yet through every name runs the same truth. Somewhere in our distant past, someone held the knowledge to command destiny itself, and those who came after made sure it would never fall into human hands again. When Rome rose to power, it did not only conquer nations, it conquered stories. By the time the Church began to form the biblical canon in the early centuries after Christ, the world's oldest myths had already been told for thousands of years. Yet in the dim candlelight of scriptoria, as priests copied sacred texts by hand, something extraordinary happened. The stories of Mesopotamia were rewritten, their names erased, their symbols rebranded, their meanings sanctified under a new divine order. The gods of Sumer and Babylon did not vanish, they were baptized. Anu, Enlil, and Enki were reduced to shadows, replaced by the single image of one god, stripped of form, stripped of history. The goddess Inanna, the bright star of Venus, was transformed into the Virgin Mary, the serpent of wisdom. Once Enki's sacred emblem became the devil's disguise. The flood of Ziusudra became Noah's Ark. The Tower of Babel replaced the ziggurat of Babylon. Each story was preserved, yet disguised. The ancient roots of creation, rebellion, and divine judgment were hidden beneath new names, reshaped to fit a faith that demanded only one truth. It was not an accident, it was a design. When the early church fathers assembled the books of the Bible, they drew from every corner of the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Hymn of Enki, all echoed in their scriptures. But they could not allow the faithful to know that these stories were older, far older, than the God of Israel. To admit that would mean admitting that the foundation of Christianity was built upon the stones of forgotten temples. So, the scribes changed the story. They purified it. They claimed that their God was not one among many, but the original, eternal, unchallenged. They turned ancient wisdom into revelation and labelled the rest as pagan corruption. Rome did not invent this idea. It perfected it. In a world filled with competing gods and philosophies, control of the divine narrative meant control of the human mind. The Church's silence was its greatest weapon. No debates, no acknowledgements, no footnotes to older civilizations. Only scripture, sealed by divine authority. Over time, the silence became law. The old gods faded into myths. The clay tablets crumbled into dust, and those who dared to suggest that the Bible borrowed from Mesopotamian legends were branded heretics. Yet the similarities were impossible to ignore. The first light of creation, the moulding of man from clay, the divine flood, the punishment of pride, the laws carved in stone, all appeared first in Sumer, centuries before Moses or Christ. The Church's answer was to stay silent, to erase without admitting, to absorb without confessing. And that silence still echoes today. Beneath every cathedral, beneath every altar, lies a truth older than Rome itself. The Bible was not born in isolation. It was born from the dust of forgotten empires, written in the language of Sumer, reshaped in Latin, and sealed by faith. The divine rebranding was complete. The world would remember the story, but never its source. In the oldest Sumerian stories, Enlil ruled as the god of wind and storm, a power both feared and worshipped. He was the enforcer of divine law, the guardian of order, and the punisher of mankind when they grew too loud, too proud, or too free. He sent floods, famine, and fire, not out of malice, but to remind humanity of its place. When the Bible later describes Yahweh thundering from the heavens, casting judgment on sinners, and flooding the earth to cleanse it, the resemblance is more than coincidence. The traits of Enlil live on, reshaped, renamed, and canonized. The transition from many gods to one did not erase Enlil, it transformed him. In the Sumerian tablets, Enlil stood above kings. His voice was the wind itself, his anger the roar of storms. No one could look upon him directly. His commands were absolute. When he ordered the destruction of mankind in the great flood, the lesser gods trembled and obeyed. When he decreed silence over the earth, the rivers stopped and the crops failed. His justice was merciless, yet he saw it as divine necessity. To question Enlil was to invite ruin. The Hebrews, who later settled in Mesopotamia, absorbed these ideas, whether consciously or through cultural inheritance. Their God, Yahweh, soon took on the same character, a being of law, of thunder, of retribution, a God who punished disobedience and demanded loyalty. Even the imagery remained. Yahweh descended upon mountains shrouded in cloud and lightning, spoke in thunder, and called himself jealous. Just like Enlil, he destroyed cities that defied him and rewarded those who obeyed without question. But there is a subtle shift. In Sumer, Enlil was one of many. He held authority because he enforced balance among the gods. In Israel, Yahweh became the only one. His storms no longer shared the sky. The pantheon had collapsed into a single will. Yet the tone, the language, and the power remained the same. When early scribes translated older stories into Hebrew, they replaced Enlil's name with the divine title Adonai, then later with Yahweh. The result was a seamless transformation from polytheism to monotheism, one that preserved the essence while concealing its origin. Over centuries, this change became sacred truth, and anyone who pointed to older parallels was branded a blasphemer. But the evidence endures in the clay tablets. The flood, the wrath, the thunder, all began with Enlil. His symbol was the horned crown of authority, the same motif found on the earliest depictions of Yahweh in ancient Canaanite art. The Church would later soften his image, turning fear into reverence, judgment into salvation. But behind that transformation, the shadow of Enlil still lingers. The god of storms became the god of commandments. The enforcer became the creator. And humanity, still kneeling in awe of divine thunder, never realized it was listening to the same voice echoing through different names. What changed was not the god, but the story we were told about him. In the story of Eden, a serpent slithers into the garden and changes everything with a whisper. It offers humanity the one thing the Creator forbade: knowledge. The Church would later call it the voice of temptation, the enemy of God, the bringer of sin. But thousands of years before Genesis was ever written, the Sumerians told of another figure who did the same thing, not as a deceiver, but as a saviour. His name was Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, the God who gave mankind understanding. He was the one who taught humans language, architecture, medicine, and the ways of the stars. To the Sumerians, he was not evil. He was light in the darkness. In the earliest tablets, Enki's symbol is the serpent, coiled around a tree, guarding the waters of life. He stands beside Inanna, the goddess of rebirth, teaching her the secrets of the world. When you read the story of Eden with this image in mind, the parallels are impossible to ignore. A tree of life, a serpent of wisdom, and a divine power that forbids knowledge. It is the same story retold through a different lens, one that turned a teacher into a traitor. In Sumer, Enki defied the gods when they tried to keep mankind ignorant. He shared their secrets, not to overthrow them, but to help humans grow beyond servitude. The same act that gave birth to civilization was later rewritten as the first sin. The serpent, once a sacred emblem of healing and transformation, became the symbol of corruption. The Church taught that curiosity led to the fall, but the ancients believed curiosity was what made us divine. When Enki gave knowledge, he did not curse humanity, he awakened it. The tablets say he opened the eyes of man so they could see as the gods see, to know light from shadow and truth from illusion. In that moment, humanity changed forever. In the eyes of Enlil, this was rebellion. In the eyes of Enki, it was liberation. And perhaps that is why the two stories cannot coexist. The Church could not allow a serpent to represent enlightenment. It had to represent danger. Yet the truth remains buried in stone. In temples dedicated to Enki, archaeologists have found carvings of intertwined serpents, symbols that would later appear again in Greek mythology as the staff of Hermes, and even today in the symbol of medicine, the caduceus. The serpent has always represented knowledge and renewal. Only later did it become the enemy of heaven. When the Church rewrote the myth, it kept the serpent but changed its meaning. What was once the bringer of light became the father of lies. But behind that mask, the spirit of Enki still flickers. The voice that whispers to humanity, to question, to seek, to learn. Maybe the serpent was never the villain. Maybe it was the first friend we ever had. Before there was Eve, before Mary, before any mention of a woman in the pages of the Bible, there was Ninhursag, the mother goddess of Sumer, sculptor of flesh and breath, healer of humanity's first wounds. She was the divine mother who shaped mankind alongside Enki, using the clay of the earth and the spark of the gods. In the earliest creation tablets, it is Ninhursag who molds the human body, Enki who fills it with life, and together they watch as the first humans rise from the riverbanks. She is called the womb of the mountains, the lady of life, the one who restores balance when creation goes astray. But as time passed, her name was buried under dust and doctrine. The rise of patriarchal faiths erased her from memory, replacing her with a male creator who needed no mother. Her temples were dismantled, her symbols absorbed into the worship of new gods, and the feminine divine vanished from the story of creation. In Sumerian myth, Ninhursag's compassion stood as a counterpoint to the wrath of Enlil. When humanity suffered from famine, it was she who pleaded for mercy. When Enki grew sick from consuming forbidden plants, it was Ninhursag who healed him by giving birth to 8 new deities, each representing a cure for his pain. Her power was not destructive, it was restorative. She represented the balance between creation and correction, something the later world would forget. When the Church formed its theology, the divine feminine was deliberately subdued. The goddess who gave life became a mortal woman who gave birth. Ninhursag's role as the equal of the gods was rewritten into a symbol of obedience and purity. Yet in older cultures, she was revered as the heart of nature itself, the force that binds life and death. Every seed, every birth, every healing act was seen as her work. The loss of Ninhursag marked more than the erasure of a deity. It marked the silencing of the sacred feminine. Archaeologists have found her symbols carved into ancient seals, a woman crowned with horns of divinity, surrounded by mountains and streams. Her name appears in hymns that predate the Old Testament by centuries. She was not a myth to those who worshipped her. She was the essence of creation, the bridge between earth and sky. When her story was replaced, something shifted in human history. Creation became an act of dominance rather than harmony. The world was no longer born from balance but from command. The nurturing mother became the distant father, and the feminine presence that once healed creation was branded as weakness. Even the story of Eve carries her shadow. Eve, formed from Adam's rib, mirrors Ninhursag healing Enki's rib in the oldest texts. The parallels are too precise to ignore, yet one is called divine compassion, the other human disobedience. Ninhursag's name may be forgotten, but her spirit lingers in every culture that still honours the Mother Earth, the nurturing force that sustains all life. The ancients saw no division between God and goddess, between creation and compassion. Only later did mankind decide the heavens had room for only one face, and it would not be hers. Before the Bible ever spoke of Eden, the Sumerians wrote of a place called Dilmun. It was the land where the sun rose, the place where the gods first walked, a paradise untouched by death or disease. The tablets describe it as a walled garden by the sea, lush with fruit and rivers of pure water that flowed from the deep. It was not heaven, but a real place, believed to lie somewhere in the Persian Gulf, where the rivers Tigris and Euphrates once met the ocean. In Dilmun, the gods lived in peace, the air was clean, and the earth knew no sorrow. Animals did not prey upon one another, and man had no need for labour or pain. It was a world of perfect balance. To the Sumerians, Dilmun was not only a dream of paradise, it was memory. They believed it existed before the Great Flood, before corruption and mortality entered the world. The story of Enki and Ninhursag tells how even paradise could not remain pure forever. When Enki wandered through the garden and tasted its sacred plants, he disturbed the order of life. His act brought sickness into the world, and it was Ninhursag who healed him, restoring the harmony that had been broken. The tale is hauntingly familiar. A divine garden, a forbidden act, a loss of innocence. Yet in this older version, the story ends not with punishment, but with forgiveness. The garden is restored, and the gods learn compassion. Thousands of years later, the same story appears again, rewritten in Hebrew, retitled The Garden of Eden. The sea becomes a river that waters 4 lands. The gods become one god. The act of curiosity becomes sin. The serpent, once the helper of mankind, becomes its deceiver. What was once a story of healing becomes a warning against disobedience. Dilmun's memory is hidden beneath Eden's shadow. Archaeologists have found traces of the Sumerian paradise in ancient trade routes stretching toward Bahrain, where temples to Enki and Ninhursag once stood. They called it the land of the living, the meeting place of heaven and earth. It was said that the water of life flowed there, and those who drank from it would never die. The Bible's river of life, the fountain that flows from the throne of God, echoes the same vision. Both speak of a place lost, a paradise remembered only in fragments. Perhaps the story of Eden was never about the first humans at all, but about a civilization trying to remember what it had lost. When the church later told the story, it turned that memory into morality. Paradise was no longer a place on earth, but a reward after death. The gates were closed, and only faith could open them again. But for the Sumerians, Dilmun was real. It was a promise that once, long ago, humanity lived alongside its creators. A time when the world was whole, the waters were pure, and the garden of the gods still bloomed by the sea. In the earliest stories ever told, curiosity was not a sin, it was sacred. The Sumerians believed that to seek knowledge was to imitate the gods, to reach closer to the divine mind that had shaped the stars and the earth. When Enki shared wisdom with mankind, he was not tempting them into rebellion, he was fulfilling their purpose. Humanity was created to learn, to question, to evolve. But thousands of years later, this same act would be twisted into the greatest crime ever committed. The church would call it the fall. The moment man disobeyed, reached for knowledge, and brought ruin upon himself. The story of original sin was not born from the clay of Sumer. It was born from Rome's desire to control the soul. In the Sumerian creation myth, the gods shaped man to serve, but also to share their spark. When humans began to grow too wise, too aware, Enlil sought to silence them, while Enki defied him and gave mankind the forbidden gifts of understanding. This was not treason, it was compassion. Knowledge was not evil, it was freedom. The serpent, Enki's symbol, represented transformation and awakening. When the Hebrews adapted this myth, the meaning was inverted. The serpent became the deceiver, the garden became a trap, and the pursuit of wisdom became the birth of sin. What was once the beginning of enlightenment became the origin of guilt. The church built its empire on this inversion. If knowledge leads to sin, then obedience must lead to salvation. If curiosity causes the fall, then faith must be blind. From that point forward, humanity was taught to fear its own potential. Every question that challenged authority was seen as defiance against God. Every discovery that unveiled the workings of the universe was treated as temptation. The church turned a story of empowerment into one of submission, and that shift changed the course of civilization. By making curiosity a curse, the church ensured that mankind would forever feel unworthy of its own brilliance. Children were taught that they were born stained, not because of their deeds, but because their ancestors dared to know. It was a perfect form of control, one that reached deeper than law or sword. It lived inside the conscience. A person who believes they are broken will never stop seeking a savior. A world convinced that knowledge is dangerous will never reclaim its freedom. The myth of original sin taught generations to look upward for redemption instead of inward for truth. But the Sumerians saw no such shame in seeking. They believed the gods themselves had once been learners, explorers of the cosmos, who became divine through understanding. To learn was to honor creation. To question was to worship. What the church called sin, the ancients called awakening. Perhaps the real fall was not when man reached for the fruit of knowledge, but when he was taught to let it rot. The moment humanity stopped asking questions, was the moment paradise truly ended. For thousands of years, the truth about humanity's origins has whispered through forgotten temples, cracked tablets, and faded scrolls. Yet those who dared to follow that whisper often paid the highest price. From the earliest Christian Gnostics, who studied the secret teachings and recognized the echoes of older civilizations in the stories of Genesis, to the archaeologists of the 19th century, scholars who uncovered Sumerian clay tablets that predated Moses by thousands of years, the path of knowledge was lined with danger. To question the Church's narrative was to risk excommunication, imprisonment, or worse. The Gnostics, for instance, saw the serpent in Eden not as a deceiver, but as a teacher, the same god the Sumerians called Enki. They studied the texts, seeking the wisdom that had been buried beneath layers of doctrine. Their insights threatened the established order, so they were branded heretics, hunted down, and erased from history. Centuries later, when scholars excavated the ruins of Ur and Babylon, they discovered tablets that detailed the creation of humanity, the flood of Ziusudra, and the ziggurats that reached toward the sky. The parallels with Genesis were undeniable, yet those who published these findings were often met with disbelief, ridicule, and censorship. Universities controlled by the Church dismissed the work. Journals refused to print it, funding disappeared, some scholars vanished without explanation, their discoveries left to gather dust in private archives, and still the pattern repeats. Even today, independent researchers who trace the origins of myth and scripture find themselves marginalized. They are labeled conspiracy theorists, extremists, or revisionists. Yet the evidence they follow is as real as the clay and stone that survived thousands of years. The Church's influence extended beyond religion. It controlled the narrative of history, deciding what could be taught, what could be published, and what must remain forgotten. Knowledge itself became a dangerous currency. To see the truth was to place oneself outside the protection of authority. Scholars learned to write carefully, to phrase their findings in ambiguous terms, to avoid angering the guardians of orthodoxy. Many of the earliest archaeologists recognized that Genesis was not an isolated text. It carried echoes of Sumer, Babylon, and Akkad, stories older than the Hebrew people themselves. The flood, the creation from clay, the divine gift of knowledge, all these had precedence. To the Church, acknowledging these parallels would undermine its claim to unique revelation. Therefore, the message was clear. Curiosity that threatened the story was punished. The pursuit of truth became synonymous with rebellion, and yet, despite centuries of suppression, fragments of the past survive. Clay tablets endure, ziggurats remain. Ancient symbols persist in art, architecture, and literature. Those who pay attention can read between the lines. Every erased name, every censored manuscript, every silenced scholar is a clue. It tells us that the story we are taught is only part of a much larger truth. Scholars and heretics, past and present, remind us that curiosity is not a crime. The pursuit of knowledge is a rebellion that continues to shape history, quietly defying the silence imposed by centuries of authority. In the year 1849, a team of archaeologists arrived at the ruins of Nineveh, the once great Assyrian capital. They were digging in a city that had been buried beneath centuries of sand and debris, unaware that they were about to uncover one of the greatest treasures of human history. What they found would change everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Beneath the fallen walls and crumbling palaces lay the library of Ashurbanipal, a collection of thousands of clay tablets that had survived for over 2,500 years. These tablets were not ordinary records. They contained the myths, laws, histories, and scientific knowledge of Sumer and Babylon. The flood of Ziusudra, the creation of man from clay, the ziggurats that reached toward the heavens, and the stories of the gods who walked among men were all preserved in their fragile inscriptions. For the first time in centuries, the oldest civilizations of Mesopotamia spoke again, yet the discovery was met with silence from those in power. The church, which had long controlled the narrative of history and scripture, did not respond. There were no proclamations, no warnings, no debates in the halls of Rome. It was as if these revelations had never occurred. Scholars who studied the tablets recognized immediately that the parallels with Genesis and later biblical stories were too precise to ignore. The flood, the serpent, the divine gifting of knowledge, the creation of mankind in clay, all of it existed centuries before Moses. Yet to suggest that humanity's oldest myths had been borrowed, reshaped, or erased by later religious authorities was dangerous. Many archaeologists and historians worked quietly, knowing that the powerful institutions that shaped scholarship could marginalize or dismiss their findings. The tablets spoke of a world in which gods were not distant, but present, walking among humans and shaping their destiny. They described a civilization capable of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and architecture, far beyond what scholars had imagined for that era. These were the truths that the Church had long allowed to remain buried, hidden beneath layers of tradition and dogma. The Library of Ashurbanipal was a window into a time before Christianity, before Rome, before the rewriting of history into a story of obedience and sin. For the first time, the voices of the Sumerians and Babylonians could be heard without the filters imposed by later authorities. And yet, the Church's silence continued to echo by controlling the narrative of history, by ignoring discoveries that challenged orthodoxy. It maintained its grip on collective memory. The clay tablets were preserved, yes, but their lessons were almost invisible to the public. Only those willing to dig, to read, and to question could glimpse the forgotten truths. Nineveh's library became more than an archaeological wonder. It became a symbol of what happens when knowledge is hidden, when truth is deferred, and when power prefers silence over revelation. And still, even today, the story of the Sumerians waits to be told fully, buried in the ink of scholars who dare to speak and the clay that survived time itself. When the first translations of the Sumerian epic of creation appeared in the mid-19th century, the world of biblical scholarship trembled. These clay tablets, written in cuneiform thousands of years before Moses, told stories that were strikingly familiar yet profoundly different. The creation of man from clay, the gift of wisdom from the gods, the great flood, and even the divine council that governed heaven and earth were all recorded in meticulous detail. For the first time, scholars could read the voices of the gods themselves. What they revealed was unthinkable. Genesis was not the beginning. It was a carefully edited version of a much older story. The similarities were undeniable. The flood of Ziusudra mirrored Noah. Enki, the giver of knowledge, mirrored the serpent. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, echoed in Eve. Yet the tone and purpose had shifted. The Sumerians celebrated curiosity, innovation, and the divine spark within humanity. The biblical text, however, transformed that same curiosity into disobedience and sin. The translators, often cautious and meticulous, could barely believe what they were reading. The gods of Mesopotamia were not distant and unknowable. They argued, they experimented, they cared. They intervened to guide humanity, not to punish it for ambition. And while the Church had long taught that man fell from grace because of pride, the tablets suggested something radically different. Humanity had been given gifts to flourish. It was the gods themselves who debated how much freedom to allow. These translations exposed the invisible hand of editing that had shaped centuries of belief. Stories that had been told for millennia, stories written in clay before Abraham, before Sinai, before the canon, had been repurposed. Names were changed, roles were reassigned. Enlil became Yahweh. Enki became the serpent. Ninhursag disappeared, replaced by a male figure, or simply erased. Every moral lesson in Genesis carried echoes of older wisdom, but rewritten to serve a centralized authority. The shock was not just academic, it was cultural. The epic of creation revealed a humanity that had been active, curious, and creative from the very start. It depicted a world in which knowledge was a gift, not a curse, and where the gods were participants in the human journey rather than distant judges. Scholars began to question the foundations of religious history. If Genesis was edited, what else had been reshaped? What other truths had been buried beneath centuries of doctrine and tradition? And the church remained largely silent, neither confirming nor denying the translations, letting the established narrative persist. In the quiet of libraries, the gods returned, not in fire or cloud, but in words carved into clay, rediscovered after millennia. They spoke of creation not as an act of command, but as a dialogue, not as obedience, but as collaboration. And for those who read carefully, the first truth of humanity could be glimpsed again. Genesis was not the beginning. It was only the story that someone wanted us to believe. The real beginning, older and richer, had always been waiting in the tablets, hidden in the language of the gods. When the translations of the Sumerian tablets began to circulate in the 19th century, the church faced a choice. Open acknowledgement could undermine centuries of authority, yet complete denial would draw attention to the findings. The solution was subtle and strategic. Instead of outright denial, the Vatican quietly absorbed the discoveries into the category of mythology, presenting them as interesting stories from a distant past, rather than evidence of an older history that predated scripture. The Library of Ashurbanipal and the Tablets of Ur, with their creation myths, flood accounts, and divine councils, were never publicly condemned. They were simply reclassified. The Church's official documents, written in Latin and kept in archives that few could access, subtly redirected scholars and the faithful away from the Mesopotamian sources. Those who studied the texts academically were reminded that ancient myths were allegories, literary exercises, and moral tales, not historical fact. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. By framing the Sumerian epics as legend rather than evidence, the Church maintained the primacy of Genesis as the authoritative account of creation, original sin, and divine law. To the public, the story of Adam and Eve remained untouched. The serpent was evil, the flood was unique, and knowledge was a gift granted by one God alone. Meanwhile, the details of the older civilizations were preserved in the shadows, known to a few scholars who could navigate the Vatican's extensive archive, but never shared with the broader world. This containment ensured that the influence of the tablets could be monitored and controlled. Popular textbooks, religious instruction, and even lectures at universities continued to teach the biblical version as history. The Mesopotamian parallels were mentioned only in footnotes that many would never read. Over decades, this quiet absorption became institutionalized. When new discoveries were made, whether in Nineveh, Babylon, or Sumer, the Church did not need to issue statements. It simply allowed the narrative to be reframed. A tablet of Ziushudra became an example of folklore. The story of Enki and Ninhursag was described as allegory. The flood of Ashur and the Tower of Babylon were positioned as exotic curiosities rather than evidence of a lost past. Scholars who insisted on drawing direct parallels were often questioned, subtly discredited, or advised to focus on more conventional areas of study. And so the pattern continued. The Vatican's silence was not ignorance, it was calculation. By controlling interpretation, by quietly directing attention away from the oldest sources, it maintained authority over the story of humanity's beginnings. The strategy worked. To this day, most people encounter the story of creation through the lens the Church provided. The oldest myths, the voices of gods who walked among men, and the knowledge they passed on remain largely hidden, tucked away in libraries, archives, and academic texts few read. The Church did not need to erase the Sumerians. It only needed to ensure that their stories were remembered in a way that preserved its power. By quietly redirecting the narrative, the Vatican kept the past intact, but inaccessible, and the truth of humanity's origins remained under lock and key. Long before the invention of telescopes, before Galileo lifted his glass to the skies, the Sumerians looked up and understood the cosmos with a precision that still astonishes modern astronomers. On clay tablets preserved for over 4,000 years, they recorded the movements of planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the cycles of Venus, the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, and even predicted lunar and solar eclipses with astonishing accuracy. Their observations were not random or mythic. They were precise, methodical, and systematic. The tablets described mathematical calculations and tables that tracked the heavens as reliably as any modern almanac. How could a people living in the Bronze Age know such things? They had no telescopes, no lenses, no instruments we would recognize as scientific, yet they observed, measured, and recorded. Some scholars suggest that the Sumerians had access to knowledge inherited from even older civilizations, wisdom carefully preserved and passed down through generations. Perhaps they built observatories atop ziggurats, using the height of the towers to map the stars and the alignment of the heavens. Perhaps they understood the cycles of planets not just through sight, but through a tradition of observation that stretched back into prehistory. Their cosmology was deeply entwined with their mythology. The gods themselves moved through the sky. Enlil's storms and Enki's wisdom were reflected in celestial patterns. The cycle of life and death, creation and destruction, was mirrored in the motions of planets, the rising and setting of stars, and the flow of rivers on Earth. Yet the Church would later frame astronomy differently. Knowledge of the heavens was tightly controlled. Observations that challenged Scripture were labelled heresy. Scholars like Galileo faced trial for daring to suggest that the cosmos did not revolve around man and his God. The Sumerians, by contrast, recorded without fear, documenting patterns for practical purposes like agriculture, navigation, and ritual timing. Their cosmology was both science and story, merging mathematics with myth. In the library of Ashurbanipal, tablets reveal charts that describe interplanetary cycles in ways that align with modern calculations. The precision is shocking. They predicted eclipses decades in advance, long before telescopes could confirm them. The knowledge persisted quietly, buried in clay and later in libraries, waiting for centuries to be rediscovered. And yet, even after excavation, the implications have often been minimized. The Vatican's archives and other centers of power have maintained a careful silence, allowing mainstream science and religion to separate the heavens from the wisdom of the ancients. The hidden cosmology of the Sumerians is a reminder that humanity once looked to the skies and understood more than we give them credit for. Their observations challenge our assumptions about the past, suggesting a continuity of knowledge that spans millennia. They measured time, mapped the heavens, and encoded cosmic cycles into the stories of gods and men. And they did it without telescopes, without modern instruments, relying only on the patient eye and the memory of generations. Their stars still shine in the tablets, waiting for those willing to see beyond the stories we have been taught. In the 21st century, the gods of Sumer no longer walk openly among men, yet their presence is felt more than ever. The Anunnaki, once the rulers of heaven and earth, have returned in a new form, not as beings of flesh and bone, but as symbols of knowledge that was long forbidden, of mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about humanity and its origins. Across the world, scholars, researchers, and curious minds are uncovering evidence that ancient civilizations possessed understanding far beyond what traditional history allows. The flood, the creation of man from clay, the divine gifting of knowledge, the alignment of stars. These were not merely myths. They are reminders of a consciousness that reaches deeper than written history and older than any church-sanctioned timeline. The Anunnaki appear in modern discourse as guides to the hidden history of Earth, the keepers of secrets that the powerful have sought to control for millennia. Their stories are encoded in clay tablets, carved into stone, whispered in myths that survived even when empires fell. And now, with digital archives, independent research, and global scholarship, the secrets are resurfacing. But the Anunnaki are not just symbols of the past. They represent a challenge to the way humanity understands itself. They demand that we question the official narratives, that we look beyond the stories handed down through religion and textbooks, and that we consider the possibility of knowledge that predates civilization as we know it. Some theorists even suggest that the Anunnaki are linked to phenomena beyond Earth, visitors from distant worlds who influenced early human development and seeded the spark of civilization. Whether literal or metaphorical, they embody the idea that humanity's origins are more complex than we have been taught. The Church and other authorities have long attempted to suppress this knowledge, framing these ancient figures as myth or legend, discrediting those who study them as fanatics or conspiracy theorists. Yet their influence cannot be erased. Every discovery, every tablet translated, every symbol uncovered brings the Anunnaki back into the collective awareness. In popular culture, they have been reinvented as aliens, gods, and archetypes of forbidden wisdom. Writers, filmmakers, and theorists draw upon their myths to explore the nature of creation, the limits of human knowledge, and the possibility that consciousness itself is a gift or inheritance from beyond our planet. The Anunnaki are no longer bound to temples or ziggurats. They live in ideas, in questions that challenge authority, in the relentless search for truth. Their story reminds us that knowledge was once a dangerous thing, that the pursuit of it can bring both enlightenment and persecution, and that those who control information have long sought to define what humanity may know. Today, the return of the Anunnaki is quiet but undeniable. They are present in the curiosity of those who ask questions, in the courage of those who study the forgotten past, and in the growing awareness that history may not be what we have been told. They are no longer gods to be worshipped, but symbols to be understood, and in that understanding lies the freedom to reclaim what was once hidden. For thousands of years, humanity told its own story. The first clay tablets from Sumer recorded creation, floods, divine councils, and the shaping of man from clay. They told of gods who walked among mortals, who granted knowledge, who guided and healed. Every symbol, every line of cuneiform was a testament to human curiosity and divine interaction. This was history written not by kings or priests, but by a civilization trying to understand itself and its place in the cosmos. Yet over time, that story was taken. The Church, rising in power and influence, began to rewrite the narrative. The tablets were not destroyed entirely, but their meanings were altered, hidden, and buried beneath layers of theology. Enlil, the storm god who punished humanity in Sumerian myth, became Yahweh, the one god of judgment. Enki, the bringer of wisdom and teacher, became the serpent of temptation. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who healed and nurtured, was erased entirely, replaced by a male-centered creation story. The Great Flood was reshaped, the creation of man recast, and the divine council silenced. What had once been a tale of empowerment became a tale of obedience. Knowledge, once celebrated, became a sin. Curiosity, once sacred, became forbidden. In reshaping these ancient stories, the Church did more than impose religious doctrine. It seized control over the collective memory of humanity. By framing the earliest myths as allegory or myth, by canonizing only certain texts, it ensured that generations would believe a narrative shaped to maintain authority. The history of human ingenuity, the careful observations of the stars, the mathematical knowledge encoded in ziggurats and tablets, all were left in the shadows. Scholars who tried to piece together the original story were branded heretics, silenced, or marginalized. Archaeological discoveries, like the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, revealed the truth that had been hidden for millennia. Thousands of tablets contained records older than Genesis, describing events, laws, and wisdom that predated Abraham by thousands of years. Yet even in the face of evidence, the official story remained unchanged. The Church did not need to erase the past. It only needed to control the narrative, decide which parts could be seen and which would remain buried. In doing so, it stole more than tablets or texts. It stole humanity's memory. Each time a child learned the story of creation from Scripture, each time the narrative of a dark age was taught in schools, the ancient truths were forgotten. History became a tool to shape belief rather than to understand reality, and still, fragments survive. Clay tablets, ancient inscriptions, and scattered myths whisper of a time when humanity was more than a follower of divine command. They tell of a civilization that understood its own beginnings and the workings of the world. The theft of humanity's story was not complete, but it was enough to make us question what we have been taught. The true story of creation, once recorded in cuneiform, waits for those who dare to read between the lines and reclaim the history that was stolen. Long before the Bible wrote, "Let there be light," the Sumerians whispered of a first illumination, a moment when knowledge flowed freely and humanity saw the world in its full brilliance. This was not the light of fire or sun alone. It was the light of understanding, the spark given by Enki, nurtured by Ninhursag, and witnessed by gods who walked among men. In those earliest days, clay was moulded into life, words were taught, rivers were mapped, and the heavens recorded with precision that would astonish future astronomers. The first light was a memory of awareness, a recognition that humanity had the capacity to comprehend the world, to reach beyond instinct, and to create. But this light did not last. Over centuries, it was sealed away, hidden in temples, buried in tablets, and later locked in the frameworks of religion. The Church, in consolidating its authority, chose obedience over curiosity, silence over discovery, and ritual over reason. The memory of that first illumination survived only in fragments, in the shadows of myths, in the subtle echoes of the Sumerian gods who once guided mankind. Yet even in shadow, it continues to shine. When we uncover the clay tablets in ancient ruins, when we read the astronomical charts etched thousands of years before telescopes, when we decode the myths of Enki, Ninhursag, and the Anunnaki, we glimpse that original spark. It reminds us that curiosity was once sacred, that learning was a gift, and that mankind was never meant to kneel in ignorance. Perhaps this first light was not lost, but delayed, patiently waiting for those who dared to seek it again. Every discovery, every question, every act of understanding becomes a flicker of that illumination. The flood, the ziggurats, the serpents, the mother goddess, all are part of a story of enlightenment, rewritten over millennia to conceal what the ancients already knew. And yet, the light persists, hidden in symbols, in stories, in the patterns of the stars, in the legacy of knowledge that the Church could never fully erase. Remembering it requires courage. It requires looking beyond what we are taught and daring to see the world through the eyes of those who first understood it. The first, "Let there be light," may not have been a command, but a reflection of a time when humans were given wisdom as naturally as breath. It was a gift, a recognition that understanding was our right, not a sin. To remember the first light is to reclaim that right, to honor the ancient teachers, and to acknowledge that knowledge itself is a form of liberation. Even if it was sealed away, even if it was hidden beneath layers of doctrine, the spark endures. It waits for us in the stars, in the tablets, and in the whisper of every question we dare to ask. And when we remember, truly remember, we are touching the first light, a moment when humanity once shone fully, before obedience dimmed the brilliance, before curiosity was labelled sin, and before the story of mankind was rewritten. The light is still there, we only need to see it again.